Welcome to the Mystery Revealed. Today we'll be exploring in depth one of the most remote and mysterious places on Earth, Antarctica. Far more than just a frozen wasteland, Antarctica has sparked countless theories about ancient civilizations, secret bases, and submerged structures lurking beneath the ice. We'll journey into legends, scientific research, and wild speculations that claim humans, or perhaps someone else, left traces of advanced societies under miles of glacial cover. Prepare to question how much we truly know about our planet's past. Could Antarctica have been ice-free thousands of years ago, allowing a flourishing civilization to thrive? Does the continent's bizarre landscape hide the ruins of an ancient culture? Or are these stories just imaginative tales, fueled by isolated discoveries and sensational headlines? We'll sift through historical accounts, examine modern expeditions, and consider the tantalizing possibility that Antarctica might be guarding secrets far older and far stranger than we ever imagined. Let's dive right in, starting with the continent's unique geography and climate shifts that could have allowed large-scale human or pre-human activity. Antarctica's geographic and climatic evolution. Antarctica is often described as the coldest, driest, and windiest continent on Earth. Today, the landscape is dominated by ice sheets that can be miles thick, but it wasn't always like this. Millions of years ago, during the age of the dinosaurs, Antarctica was part of the supercontinent Gondwana and featured a temperate or even subtropical climate. Fossil evidence reveals ferns, amphibians, and prehistoric forests once flourished here. Even on much shorter timescales, tens of thousands of years, global temperatures have fluctuated drastically. Some researchers argue that there could have been warmer periods when large parts of Antarctica's coastline or interior were at least partially ice-free. Others suggest that cyclical shifts in Earth's tilt and orbit might have led to brief windows of more hospitable conditions. However, the debate rages on. Mainstream science supports the notion that Antarctica has been heavily glaciated for millions of years, even if certain peripheral regions thawed periodically. Still, fringe theorists interpret ancient maps, curious anomalies in satellite imaging, or under-ice radar scans as proof of something more. Could ancient seafarers have mapped the continent's ice-free coastlines? Are there hidden caverns, subglacial lakes, or megalithic structures? Understanding Antarctica's climate evolution is key to evaluating these claims. If certain pockets of land were exposed or comparatively milder, it's conceivable that migrating cultures might have visited, though proof of permanent large-scale settlements remains elusive. Let's move on to some of the earliest accounts and explorations that fueled the notion of a lost land beneath the ice. Early explorations and surprising clues. Modern exploration of Antarctica began in earnest in the 19th century. Explorers like James Cook, Fabian von Bellingshausen, and later James Clark Ross braved treacherous waters, forging a path to the frozen continent. They returned with stories of immense ice shelves, strange wildlife, and swirling southern skies, a land truly at the edge of the known world. Intriguingly, certain historical documents suggest that medieval or even ancient civilizations might have had knowledge of an ice-free or partially ice-free Antarctica. The infamous Piri Reis map of 1513, compiled by an Ottoman admiral, shows land masses at the southern extremity that some interpret as Antarctica's coastline. Supporters of this theory claim that the map's level of detail is impossible without an older source depicting Antarctica ice-free. Skeptics point out that map inaccuracies and interpretative leaps abound. Still, the Piri Reis map stands as a curious artifact fueling speculation that advanced ancient navigators once charted Antarctica. Were these navigators the remnants of a highly developed maritime society? Did they pass down this knowledge through lost libraries or hidden archives? We may never know for certain, but the seeds of intrigue were planted. As official expeditions set foot on Antarctic shores in the late 1800s and early 1900s, rumors of hidden grottos, warm water caverns, or even pyramid-like formations persisted, mostly in the realm of speculation. Next, let's examine one of the most controversial ideas, that an advanced ancient civilization actually thrived there, leaving behind traces now locked beneath the ice. Theories of ancient civilizations. Some authors and alternative researchers argue that Antarctica once housed an advanced civilization that either fled or vanished when cataclysmic weather changes set in. In these accounts, the freezing of Antarctica is said to have buried entire cities under thick layers of ice. Proponents of this view sometimes connect the legend of Atlantis to a southern migration, suggesting that survivors built megalithic structures that still lie waiting. Another angle comes from ancient astronaut theories, which propose that extraterrestrial entities might have used Antarctica as a base, guiding or genetically altering early human societies. These claims usually cite vague references in mythologies or the presence of unnaturally straight lines captured in satellite photos. Mainstream archaeology, on the other hand, finds no compelling evidence of large-scale human habitation in Antarctica. Even short-term presence is deemed unlikely before modern times, given the extreme conditions, yet the mysteries persist. Some researchers reference out-of-place artifacts, like unusual stone formations or alleged metallic anomalies found during scientific drilling. Could these be remnants of an advanced culture, or are they misinterpretations of natural phenomena? Of course, the deeper question is one of possibility. If Earth's climate shifted enough, imagine 12,000 years ago, could a highly organized group have thrived on Antarctica's coastline? If so, glacial movement may have ground any traces to dust, making direct archaeological evidence nearly impossible to uncover. Next, we'll explore more modern curiosities, including claims that Nazi Germany established hidden bases in Antarctica before and during World War II, tying into broader legends of lost technology and secret knowledge. The Nazi base conspiracy and Operation Highjump. No discussion of Antarctica's hidden secrets would be complete without addressing the persistent rumors of a clandestine Nazi base in New Swabia, Neuschwabenland. According to conspiracy lore, German expeditions in the late 1930s discovered ice-free zones, underground caverns heated by geothermal energy, and potentially set up advanced laboratories. Stories of flying saucers and superweapons under the ice abound, though hard evidence is lacking. In 1946 to 1947, the US launched Operation Highjump, a massive naval expedition led by Admiral Richard E. Byrd, with the official aim of training personnel and testing equipment under polar conditions. Conspiracy theorists claim the real purpose was to root out secret Nazi strongholds and confiscate exotic technology. Some even claim that Byrd encountered hostile flying craft and retreated. The official record, however, reports no such engagement, and the expedition ended after achieving part of its objectives. While mainstream historians dismiss these Nazi-based narratives as myth, the storyline remains popular in fringe literature, particularly because Antarctica is so vast, remote, and still largely unexplored. Could hidden bunkers or advanced craft remain undiscovered? Or is this just a rehash of Cold War paranoia mixed with sensational speculation? Regardless, the Nazi-based story underscores a pattern. Antarctica is the perfect canvas for humankind's imagination, a blank, frozen slate where we can project hidden truths. Next, we'll shift from wartime legends to the actual scientific revelations. Subglacial lakes, under-ice mountains, and bizarre life forms, that have been documented in recent decades. Subglacial lakes, rivers, and mysterious formations. In recent years, our understanding of Antarctica's interior has expanded dramatically thanks to radar imaging, seismic surveys, and satellite data. Scientists have identified an extensive network of subglacial lakes and rivers, bodies of water sealed off by thousands of feet of ice, existing in total darkness for millions of years. Among the most famous is Lake Vostok, a gigantic subglacial lake beneath Russia's Vostok Station. Drilling projects have revealed hints of microbial life that might have evolved in complete isolation, offering a glimpse into survival in extreme conditions. Other lakes remain barely explored, fueling speculation about more complex organisms or even entire ecosystems locked away. Along with these lakes, there are also mountainous areas like Gamburtsev Mountains that scientists call ghost mountains, hidden beneath the ice. The combination of these subglacial formations evokes images of lost valleys, or as some might claim, hidden domains once inhabited by unknown civilizations. Could these mountains house caverns or pockets of air that ancient peoples utilized? Or is it all a geologic puzzle with perfectly natural explanations? While the scientific consensus leans toward natural processes, the thrill of discovering something extraordinary remains. As we move on, we'll dive deeper into the strangest conspiracy theories connecting extraterrestrials, ancient technology, and Antarctica's subglacial wonders. Extraterrestrial involvement theories. It's no surprise that Antarctica's eerie isolation has fueled theories involving extraterrestrials. Some claim that UFO sightings around the polar regions are more frequent than acknowledged, linking alleged off-world technology to secret installations beneath the ice. Purported leaked photos, often grainy or out of context, circulate online, showing disc-like shapes near Antarctic stations. The famous 1947 Admiral Byrd diary hoax, in which Byrd supposedly wrote about flying into a hidden land inhabited by beings with advanced technology, still gets cited in UFO circles despite lack of credible evidence. Add to this the idea that aliens may have seeded advanced knowledge in remote parts of the planet, and Antarctica becomes a prime candidate for cosmic speculation. For the scientific community, such claims are purely speculative and unsubstantiated, yet they remain captivating, partly because Antarctica is so difficult for the average person to visit or fully comprehend. Remote, perilous, and largely unmapped beneath the surface, Antarctica is the perfect setting for otherworldly intrigue. Next, let's consider some modern expeditions and the genuine breakthroughs that continue to reshape our understanding of this icy frontier. Modern expeditions and research stations. Presently, multiple nations maintain research stations across Antarctica: McMurdo Station, USA; Rothera, UK; Vostok, Russia; Zhongshan, China, and more, each pursuing its own scientific projects. These stations monitor climate patterns, study glaciology, and investigate life forms adapted to extreme cold. One of the most fascinating aspects is the Antarctic Treaty System, which prohibits military activities and mineral mining, designating Antarctica as a scientific preserve. Some interpret these regulations as an attempt to keep hidden discoveries secret, but it's more accurately a measure to protect the continent's fragile environment and ensure peaceful collaboration. Researchers today use advanced ice-penetrating radar, GPS mapping, and satellite technology to uncover the geology below. With each study, new subglacial lakes, ridges, or interesting anomalies are found. Often, these anomalies turn out to be natural geological formations, yet occasionally an unusual reading sparks fresh speculation about artificial structures. Could an unannounced discovery be quietly studied by government agencies? Or is this purely the domain of conspiracy theory? We'll soon consider the possibility of advanced lost knowledge kept from the public. Hidden archives and classified data. Conspiracists often argue that key governments or private entities hold classified data about Antarctica. They speculate the existence of hidden archives documenting archaeological finds or submerged structures. These theories usually rely on anecdotal accounts, scientists who allegedly saw something strange, or references to high-level secrecy around certain research missions. In truth, specialized knowledge does remain behind closed doors at times, whether for security, intellectual property, or simply because findings are yet to be peer-reviewed. However, nothing concrete suggests a giant cover-up of city-sized ruins. Instead, the real hidden archives might lie in massive data sets from satellites, ice core analyses, or geophysical readings that scientists haven't fully interpreted. Another facet: if an ancient civilization did exist there, leaving behind advanced artifacts, the revelation would be historic, possibly rewriting our understanding of human evolution or Earth's timeline. Some argue that radical shifts in knowledge can be suppressed to maintain social stability, yet we've seen major breakthroughs become widely public in the past. Would Antarctica be any different? The question remains: is there truly something extraordinary under the ice, or are we dealing with humanity's collective yearning for mystery? The next segment will delve into the latest scanning technologies, drilling projects, and how they may soon deliver more definitive answers, if they aren't doing so already. Cutting-edge discoveries and future missions. Thanks to scientific innovations, each passing year unravels more of Antarctica's mysteries. High-resolution satellite imagery, thermal mapping, and muon tomography are giving us sharper views of what lies below. Researchers continue to drill deeper core samples from glacial layers to analyze Earth's climatic past. Understanding how Antarctica responded to previous warming periods offers clues about our planet's future. Some planned missions aim to explore subglacial lakes using sterile robotic probes, similar to what astrobiologists envision for Jovian moons like Europa. These under-ice bodies of water may hold unique microbial ecosystems that have evolved independently for millennia. Imagine finding entirely novel life forms, or evidence that Earth's climate was once so mild that complex organisms thrived. Even more ambitious proposals suggest drilling deep enough to reach bedrock or cryptic geological formations beneath. If an actual megalithic structure were discovered, it would be the archaeological find of the millennium, catapulting Antarctica into the spotlight like never before. The likelihood, of course, is that we'll uncover fascinating but natural formations that still revolutionize our knowledge of Earth's processes. Yet the allure of something truly world-shattering remains. In our final segment, let's summarize what we've uncovered and consider how these ongoing questions fuel our collective sense of wonder. Reflecting on myth and reality, Antarctica stands as Earth's last great frontier, both physically and in our imaginations. From talk of ancient cities and cosmic visitors to more grounded but equally awe-inspiring scientific breakthroughs, the White Continent is a blank canvas for speculation. Our theories reveal more about our human craving for mystery than about Antarctica itself sometimes. On one hand, the notion of a forgotten civilization under the ice might be far-fetched, given everything we know about climate history and human migration patterns. On the other hand, we continue to find new marvels, living microorganisms in subglacial lakes, puzzling geological anomalies, and potential pockets of liquid water where no one expected. Antarctica repeatedly reminds us that Earth can still surprise us. Whether a lost advanced culture truly lies entombed in ice or not, The real story may be just as captivating. A landmass that was once green and vibrant, transformed over millennia into a realm of extremes, storing vital clues about our planet's climate, life, and future. The more we learn, the more Antarctica challenges our perceptions of what's possible on Earth. As we conclude this extended exploration, we're left with a myriad of questions and an even deeper appreciation for Antarctica's enigmatic allure. Could it hide remnants of ancient inhabitants? Maybe. For the vast majority of researchers, there's no direct evidence of city-like ruins. Yet the possibility alone sparks curiosity, fueling expeditions to peel back the layers of ice and time. Even if we never find lost pyramids or an advanced culture's technology, Antarctica's real treasures might be the insights into our planet's history and the resilience of life in extreme conditions. Each drilled core sample, each scanned subglacial lake, and each measurement of shifting ice shelves reveals more about Earth's delicate balance. In a world that often feels fully mapped and understood, Antarctica remains a testament that true frontiers still exist. Its untouched expanses challenge us to push scientific boundaries and, on a more philosophical level, remind us that wonder and possibility live on in the face of the unknown. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive. Until next time, remember that our world holds countless mysteries beneath the surface. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and never lose your sense of awe.